Chapter 19. The kingdoms of the Evervilles were small, disorganized, and generally not well respected. They were mostly cut off from the other landlocked civilizations that neighbored them, having only maritime trade and travel as, for whatever reason, Atraximos the Dread had preferred to keep his depredations inland and very rarely bothered ships. His shadow lay heavy over this whole region, however, this chain of fertile valleys separated by soaring peaks which covered the entire northern third of the continent. No single kingdom grew to great power for the same reason that the Evervilles lacked any impressive adventurer guilds or resident wizards. Atraximos would suffer no threat to his dominion. Thus, borders shifted like piles of autumn leaves, and about as often. Governments were established and overthrown nearly as quickly in an incessant sequence of usurpation, uprisings, and sometimes more peaceful transfers intended to avoid the other kind. Where power was not allowed to congregate as was its wont, it sloshed about like the contents of a jostled bowl. Colin was accustomed to thinking of the nations of the Evervilles as unimpressive, unimportant, and often not worth learning the names of, as a given name might be different by the time word of it migrated south to Rivkabad, where true civilization dwelt. It seemed fittingly ironic, then, that his first impression of the kingdom of Boisvard from the air was that it was incredibly beautiful. Not that Rivak wasn't lovely or lacked scenery, but its domain was mostly flat, with only one small mountain range, and that in the middle of an inhospitable desert. The empire had a relatively small population for the amount of territory it claimed, much of it being arid and all but useless. Cities were clustered along the coasts and agriculture along the floodplains of its three great rivers. Boisvard appeared to have a similar arrangement. Colin could see two sizable rivers and two smaller ones snaking through the huge valley over which they now soared, all with cultivated fields laid out along them. Rather than scrubland or desert between, however, the valley was filled with dense forests, pines all along its outer slopes and more rounded deciduous trees predominating near the center, where the entire valley sloped down toward an almost perfectly circular lake. The rivers drained into this as well, and appeared to originate from numerous stunning waterfalls around the rocky perimeter. The huge vale rose to foothills which were carved into terrace farms wherever water flowed close enough, rising further into the surrounding peaks. These mountains were jagged and fierce-looking, younger than the weathered old geography that existed farther south. To the north and west, they rose even higher than those surrounding the lair, most covered in snow. The smallest mountain in sight rose incongruously from the middle of the valley, perched alongside one edge of the lake. Between lake and mountain stood a city that, while of course smaller than Rivkabad, was much larger than Colin's preconceptions would have suggested. It had higher walls than any Riva city he knew, and in fact multiple rings of them, arranged in segments bracketed by even higher watchtowers. Nor, from this distance, did the place look impoverished as he had half expected. The architectural style on display in the great city and the few smaller towns dotted along the rivers was much more vertical than what he was used to, built of grey stone and dark slate roofs rather than the red and golden sandstone of home. Those roofs were not only high but steep, which he knew to be a measure to protect them from the weight of snow, a problem most places in the empire didn't suffer. Also, he could tell even from so high up and far away that the Verdi liked ornamentation. Gables, buttresses, and spires positively bristled from their structures. He suddenly felt a surge of magic. Iziaroa was doing something. Colin observed it, careful not to interact and thus disrupt her efforts, and with just a little concentration he honed in and discerned its function. This was a scrying spell. She was scanning for something. Looking for life. No, he realized, focusing closer, sapient life. She was finding the concentrations of people. With another slight nudge of effort, he slipped into the stream of data her magic was feeding her, able to gather a mirror of the same information without interrupting her efforts. It was astonishing how easily it came to him, especially given how all the priests back home had gone on and on about the difficulty of magic and what tampering with it could do to an uninitiated mind. Now, the valley positively lit up all around them as he beheld the concentrations of humanity within, blazing like the sun from its central city and to a lesser extent from the towns and villages. the latter of which he only became aware of now, as these smaller clusters of habitation had been hidden beneath tree cover. There was undoubtedly a reason for that. Izaroa banked and descended, swooping down in a wide arc toward a section of thick forest in which there were no people. No witnesses. She dipped low enough to almost graze the highest crowns, tacking back and forth as if searching for something, though she did no additional magic. Though invisible, Colin saw several flocks of disturbed birds shoot aloft in their wake, as the huge dragon was sailing close enough that the wind of her passage rustled those upper branches good and hard. Izaroa soared in a wide, irregular loop, hugging the canopy and constantly drifting this way and that. "What are we looking for?" he called out after several minutes of this. "A point of entry," she replied. "If need be I can penetrate the canopy using magic, but your presence complicates all the spells I would normally employ. No doubt we can compensate, but there's no need to reach for exotic solutions if there exists anything as prosaic as a sufficient gap. And to speak of the demon." Colin couldn't see what she did. This was not his first evidence that dragons had exceptional vision, but in his defense she had no sooner spoken than arched up again, soaring in a complete loop that brought her back down to the shadow amid the towering branches in a dive. It was all he could do to repress another whoop of exhilaration as Izaroa folded her wings, plummeting straight into what looked to him like a wall of leaves and needles. Another experience that ought to have been terrifying, but apparently he was more of a daredevil at heart than his state existence back in the archives had led him to believe. Well, that helped explain Hectria, anyhow. Izaroa arched her neck, and several branches snapped against her scales rather than smacking Colin behind them. He was grazed anyway, good and hard in fact, but the impacts proved harmless against him, partly because of the godling thing but definitely because the clothes he was wearing were layered with defensive enchantments. And then they had shot out through the haze of foliage into a dimmer and surprisingly open space. She snapped her wings wide again, arresting her descent, and they fell the remainder of the way to the ground at a much gentler pace. The impact of her claws upon the forest floor was still hard enough to shake the trees, dislodging a veritable rain of falling nuts and needles, and sending yet more birds fleeing in every direction. "Masterful!" Colin exclaimed, applauding. Izaroa dropped their invisibility spell, turning her head to smile smugly at him. Funny how the expression was so charming on her. When Fenuric surveyed Daryl she did that he mostly wanted to smack them. "Hardly my first dive, husband. Still, one likes to be appreciated. By all means, keep it up. I would only have to stop if you ceased finding ways to impress me, which I can't imagine happening." She grinned, nodding her head, and Colin carefully released the concentration of magic keeping him affixed to her back. Invoking his teleportation, he shifted instantly to a spot on the ground in front of her, and in the next moment, Izaroa herself shifted, landing beside him on two legs. Their surroundings were incredible. The trees were absolutely colossal. It was one thing to have read of such, but quite another to have these majestic titans in front of him as a contrast to the tropical trees with which he was more familiar. The very fact that there was an open space down here sufficient for a dragon to land and yet almost completely covered from above really emphasized the incredible size of these ancient sentinels. A perpetual soft whisper of their foliage in the wind made a permanent music in the dimness beneath them, which itself was pierced here and there by sunbeams which scintillated with the same shifting of the branches. In the aftermath of the dragon's landing, sounds gradually began to reappear. Colin recognized birds, though their specific calls were unfamiliar, as well as frogs and what were probably insects, but there were other noises that made less sense to his ears, blending together into a constant background of forest life. At her soft voice, he turned back to his wife, finding her examining her own clawed hands. "I am only just realizing how long it has been since I found reason to do this." "Well, not that long, I suppose. I believe my last visit here was less than a decade ago. It is still not a habit, but one never truly forgets." He felt power surge as she called up another spell, and then she shifted again. In seconds, after a single flare of light that once again briefly silenced the surrounding animals, Colin found himself standing before an apparently human woman. Interestingly, she had chosen not to modify her appearance beyond removing the extra draconic features. Her eyes had changed from gold to black, and the golden threads had vanished from her curly hair. She had no scales or spines, her tail was not in evidence, and on normal feet instead of those powerful talons it turned out she wasn't quite as tall as he. Otherwise, though, he could never fail to recognize that face. Isaroa's mahogany dark skin, full lips, and tightly curled hair belonged to a human phenotype who weren't native to this continent. Colin had of course met quite a few over the years, living and working as he did in a major center of commerce, politics, and culture, but he suspected she was going to stand out among the northern people of the Evervilles. Then again, so would he, if not as much. He doubted many Reva visited here, either. Isaroa smiled at him, tilting her head expectantly. "Have I complained recently that you're unfair?" he asked. "You have got to stop finding new ways to be beautiful, or I'm going to run out of ways to tell you that you are. And then how am I supposed to lavish you with the happiness you deserve?" She grinned broadly, in sheer unguarded delight, and slid into his arms as smoothly as if she belonged there. "On that point, husband, I have the utmost faith in your skills." Isaroa lifted her chin, cuddling against him, and it was an interesting change of pace to have to bend down to kiss her. But then he was kissing her, and the entire rest of the universe fell from relevance. This was both familiar and new. She was warm and so deliciously soft, a delight for all of his senses even without those hard and sharp edges that had made embracing her so intriguing. She pulled back after a span of time he didn't bother trying to count, smiling warmly up at him. Slightly out of breath, but fortunately not much disheveled. Colin keenly remembered Hector's displeasure when he inadvertently mussed her. And wasn't that a bucket of cold water? "I am pleased that you approve, husband," Isaroa said, her voice husky with promise. "Perhaps you prefer this form, then?" Oh, that was a trap. Fortunately he wasn't born yesterday. Colin caressed her cheek, making a show of studying her face. She obligingly let him take her by the chin and turn her head gently this way and that, smirking up at him in enjoyment of the game. It's a pleasing novelty, once in a while, but it lacks a certain you. Please never change any further than this, my love. I prefer the maximum amount of Isaroa in my Isaroa. Her grin was delighted and she stood up on her tiptoes to nuzzle at him, rubbing her forehead against his in the way she did when too impassioned to remember how humans kissed. "Ah, husband, I do so appreciate your ability to give the right answer to questions that shouldn't have one. And to think, a talent like yours was languishing away in the archives. I shall have to review my hiring and promotional practices when next I visit home." Colin hoped more than a little that they were about to resume, but Isaroa gently pulled back, twining her warm, human fingers with his as she shifted into place alongside him. Right, they were here for a purpose beyond making love in the woods. Next trip, maybe. "I wonder," he said as they strolled across the carpet of moss and fallen pine needles, "how necessary this change is? I've only met 2 dragonborn in my life, but I recalled that they resemble full dragons in humanoid form so closely that I might not be able to tell the difference. Well, I suspect I could now, but most people probably wouldn't." "It's true," she agreed, "but a dragonborn in the Evervilles is destined for a great deal of unwelcome attention. Even could I pass myself off as one, it would make it prohibitively difficult for us to conduct commerce in peace. They are uncommon anywhere, husband, only slightly less so than dragons, but particularly in these lands. They don't come here." "I see," he said carefully. "Then, are they often born in this area?" Her expression soured. "Not to my knowledge, and if I hear of any I am going to have words with Vanimax. But no. That was not among Atraximos's vices. His contempt and loathing toward mortals precluded any interest he might have taken in mortal women. He liked inflicting destruction and stealing valuables, not dallying with his victims. Colin nodded and deliberately steered the conversation elsewhere. That just leaves our appearances, then. Forgive me if I'm pestering you with questions, but I'm quite unfamiliar with the culture we're about to visit. Is Boisford enough of a backwater that a pair of foreigners will draw unwelcome attention? Some little on the road, perhaps, but the city itself is large enough that, no matter how isolated the surrounding kingdom, there will inevitably be more than a handful of exotic travelers. Enough that we will at most be interesting to the locals, not shocking. I suspect from your choice of attire that you have inferred this to a point. Colin, it is unwise to attempt to pass ourselves off as natives through magical or other subterfuge, when neither of us possess the intimate familiarity with this culture necessary to pull it off. That was exactly my reasoning, he admitted. I've met enough rich Riva that I can pretend to be one, at least. You're a rich Riva, she said, smirking up at him. Surely the richest alive, in fact. The coin in that bag of holding, as well as all the other wealth in your hoard, are yours by right of conquest, as per the custom so zealously upheld by he from whom you took it. But yes, husband, you chose well. If you have not been trained in such subterfuge, you must possess some natural knack for it. To attempt a charade we are unable to successfully carry out would only draw exactly the suspicion we must avoid. Better to be something slightly memorable, but still within the realm of understanding for those we must fool. They will see a wealthy imperial and his exotic trophy bride and think of little beyond how to extract money from us. Politely, I hope. In most cases, she said with a mysterious little smile. It's not that I'm worried about the other cases. It's hard to imagine that I could be in danger, in your company. But speaking of drawing attention. Worry not, husband, she said lightly, leaning her shoulder against his for a moment as they walked. There are uncountable ways to dispose of brigands and the like without making a mess. Colin nodded, keeping his face pleasantly blank and his thoughts behind his teeth. This was an important trait of all three of his wives, as well as their offspring, that he needed to keep in mind. As much as they could also be charming, or sexy, or petulant, smug, fascinating, and any of the other very interesting traits by which he could so easily become distracted, he must never let himself forget that they were every one of them absolutely ruthless, and had oceans of blood on their hands. By the way, I'm assuming that you do know where we are and where we're going. She laughed and squeezed his hand. Gently. Naturally, she did know both where they were and where they were going. The need to land undetected had put them an uncomfortable distance into the forest. It took an hour and a half of walking to reach the nearest road. That wasn't such a terrible experience, though. This environment was beautiful in a way that was unlike anything in Colin's experience, and he certainly couldn't fault the company. His attention for the duration was happily divided between savoring the scenery and discussing politics with his wife. Or rather, asking questions and listening avidly to her answers. He had, of course, read the Empress's treatises, the dissertations on her political philosophy upon which all governance in Rivak was based, but he wasn't a politician by vocation. To hear her expound in endless detail upon even the most minor points was as fascinating as it was enlightening. Not to mention that when she talked of matters that were so important to her interests, the animation of her features was so lovely it made his chest ache just to watch. Eventually, though, they did reach what must have been a major road. Unsurprisingly, it compared poorly to the meticulously engineered roads of the Empire, being little but a wide strip of flat, hard-packed dirt. He could tell it was engineered to at least some extent, though, not just the well-worn track where travelers happened to tread. Engraved stone mile markers had been erected at regular intervals, and branching paths had wooden signposts that were, if somewhat rustic in design, clearly maintained. Quite apart from the quality of the road itself, though, it went through the forest, so closely that he hadn't even been able to see it from above. This seemed particularly inept to Colin. Riva highways were required by law to have well-tended areas of flat ground at least 7 times the width of the road in question on each side. Not even bushes or boulders were permitted within that range, much less full-sized trees. Here, The trees grew right up to its edges, some straddling the ditches which flanked it. In fact, the highway itself swerved slightly around some of the largest pines. "What's the point of that?" he asked aloud. "Look, they took the time to carve through that hill and keep the road itself level, so the builders definitely have the engineering capability to cut down trees. The lack of clear space on both sides is just asking for bandits to set up ambushes, not to mention what would happen if a storm knocked one down across the road. It just seems negligent." "It does cause all those problems and more," Izaroa agreed quietly, her eyes ahead and face oddly neutral. "Governance is often a game of trade-offs, of course measured against one another as much as against benefits. The Verdi judge these problems acceptable costs for the benefit of keeping their roads hidden from the sky." Colin opened his mouth, and then shut it again. "Oh. We are only seeing this because we are so close to the capital," she continued. "In the outer foothills of the valley, wherever possible, the highways are tunnels. That is impractical on this terrain. Their preference for placing their structures on whole settlements against hills is for the same reason, and even where settlements exist upon flat land, they have deep roots. Fully half of any major construction in Boisvard is underground. This is a civilization shaped by fear of the sky, and what might descend from it at a moment's notice." He walked in silence for a few paces, glancing at her sidelong to take in her expression. She betrayed little, but the very fact that her features were so still told him this was a somewhat sensitive topic. "I guess," Colin said quietly after a few seconds, "that will soon change." He paused, glancing at her again as they walked on quietly, then gathered his courage. "Won't it?" Her lips bent in a slight smile and she squeezed his hand. "Oh, I very much think so. Plunder is not a habit of mine. I prefer to take my trophies from foes who presume to assail me first. Despite our many, deep differences, that is a sensibility I happen to share with Tiavathyris and even Emer Alafine. I suspect the kids make a game of grabbing the odd ox or sheep or such, but they hunt by far the majority of our game from the wild fauna of the high mountains, if only because smaller domestic beasts are scarcely worth the effort for us. It was only Atraximos who ravaged these lands. The rest of us have been so comparatively reclusive that I don't believe any of the local mortals even know our names. Very few, if any. Everything is soon to change." She paused, raising her face to study the waving branches above them, patterns of sunlight playing across her features. "That concerns us directly, Colin. Even if we do everything absolutely perfectly, his absence is going to be noticed, and soon. We have little time in which to position ourselves as best we can to face whatever comes next. The only certainty is that the political upset on this continent will be utterly beyond any precedent since the lost century." He squeezed her hand back. "Then this is a good start. The chance to poke around the closest city for a few days should provide us a glimpse of the situation on the ground, at least." She smiled up at him, but remained quiet, as the sounds of a cart approaching from behind had grown close enough that they risked being overheard, and this was not a topic for any prying ears. Colin had been surprised at the amount of traffic. They had not yet passed any other travelers on foot, but several mounts and carriages had passed them since they stepped onto the highway. The Verdi were more friendly with strangers than he was accustomed to in the Empire, waving and calling out greetings, but that was it. While some had given the two of them speculative looks, nobody had seemed interested in engaging beyond that. Now, their luck changed, as midway through the process of passing them, the donkey-pulled cart piled with burlap sacks came to a halt as its driver pulled his reins. "Good afternoon, travelers. Can I offer you a lift?" Chapter 20 or so. Colin eventually understood. It took him a moment to parse. He did speak Filvalan, but only because it was necessary to read it. A scribe of the Royal Archives of Rivkablet could not fail to be literate in at least the three most widely used languages of the continent. But even aside from his relative unfamiliarity with the spoken sounds of the language, what Colin had normally encountered was the formal Filvalan in which books, diplomatic correspondence, and trade contracts were written. This was some kind of thickly accented regional peasant dialect. And while he stood there struggling to catch up, Isaroa smoothly stepped in. "Would it not be an imposition, good sir? We should not wish to delay you, nor overtax your donkey." Her Valan was formal, of course, but the old man in the cart seemed to have no trouble following. "Oh, you're a kind soul to say so, laddie, but the pair o' you'd be no great burden to my dear Cordy. Certainly you're less heavy than today's load of potatoes. But not all weight is weight. I hate to think o' the two o' ye trudging along the highway when I could have lent a ride. I couldn't even enjoy the scenery proper, with it hanging over my head." Cordy swished her tail, ears angled backward, but did not comment. Fortunately Isaroa's discreet magic served to prevent animals from noticing they were in the presence of the ultimate apex predator. That was good to know. "If you're certain it's no trouble," Colin said carefully, glancing at Isaroa. Smiling, she inclined her head slightly in approval. "We would surely be glad of a lift. 'Tis more trouble for two such well-bred folk to share a ride with so many potatoes than for me to give it, I'd think." The man chuckled, and then made a peculiar gesture which Colin interpreted as some kind of local salute. Gripping the front brim of his white straw hat, he tugged it downward for just a second and then released it. "If your feet and your dignity can meet in the middle, old Marcel is glad to lend his cart to both. But what could be more dignified than the noble potato?" Isaroa asked, accepting Colin's help as she stepped into the cart. Not that she needed it, but she gave him a pleased smile at the courteous gesture. Truly, a more nutritionally perfect crop is hard to grow, at least without the aid of magic. I have often lamented that the climate and geography at home are less than suitable for them. "Southerners, then, Marcel asked cheerfully, flicking the reins. Cordy audibly sighed but pulled forward with no further complaint, and they began moving down the road again. Their rescuer was clearly a man in his latter years, hunched and gnarled from a life of hard work, but seemed in remarkably high spirits. "Floodplain farming, that's where the adventure is, as I hear it. Rivak's aquaculture is famous. I've not had the pleasure o' tasting that golden rice grown down yonder. Up here in the valleys we grow a bit o' rice in the terrace farms, but it's not the same. It's impressive to meet a lady with an interest in farming." "My lady's interests are diverse, and her expertise even more so," Colin said gallantly. Isaroa rewarded him with another warm little smile. "Aye, Millard, 'tis plain to the eyes you're a luckier man than most. If a body might ask, how two such well-dressed travelers come to be afoot so deep in the valley? I know the Southlands are peaceful, but 'tis unwise to wander here in the vales. I fear we suffered a rather embarrassing mishap with our chariot in the forest," Isaroa said smoothly. "Presumably we can arrange for replacement mounts in Boisford." "Oh, why can't get most things in the city, I should think. It's no riv cabot, but it's fair good enough for most aims." "I thought we were in Boisford?" Colin inquired. "The country is named for the city, husband." "Ah. No shame, Millard, these things come and go," Marcel said merrily. "In me pa's time, Boisford was part o' Hegelstadt, valley and all. No call to bother knowing it unless ye live here." "What news of the valley, Marcel?" Isaroa asked. "'Tis a good time to visit, laddie. As good a time as there ever is, any rate. The dread was seen a week ago, fleeing northeast to Arvenhill. Means he'll be quiet another week or so, most like. Not that he hasn't sprung the odd surprise now and again, but he's a creature o' habit, he is. From farm to village market to the city, all the talk of late is about the Lord of Chains, way off in the Nurdles. I hear tell he's all but pushed the Outlanders off the continent entire. That's the rule, here in the Vales, if the news is all foreign, the news is good." Colin had known the Vervels were isolated, and this was a farmer in a small interior kingdom besides, but that was more behind the times than he'd expected. Even he was more up-to-date than that. In fact, the Lord of Chains conquered the Zouzi Expeditionary Holdings last year, he said. The last news I heard from south of the Vales was that he'd taken most of them prisoner and put them to work tearing down their own fortifications. Isaiah turned a suddenly serious gaze on him. I was not aware of this. Oh. Actually, he didn't know how much information she got from Rev Cabot, or by what means. It was known, or at least claimed by the Regency, that the Empress watched over them from afar, but Colin hadn't gotten around to inquiring about the specifics. Surely the Lord Regent had a way to contact her in the event of a crisis? The Zaozi never approached Riva territory, he reassured her, otherwise the Empire would have responded. I'm sure they are monitoring the situation with the Lord of Chains. To repel an incursion is one thing, she said seriously. If he has taken to conscripting their own forces, Zhao's likely to respond with more ferocity than their initial attempt at colonization. Well, it's a long way from here, either way, Marcel said cheerily. I thank ye for bringing me news, Lord. That'll make old Marcel a hit at the market this week, and no mistake. I'm curious, said Colin. Considering how slow news apparently is to reach Boisford, you're remarkably up-to-date on the movements of attracts. HSS. Marcel suddenly hissed in alarm, shooting upright in his seat with a pained grimace. The old man actually swiveled his head rapidly to scan the treetops above before catching himself. I mean, that is, humble apologies, Lord. Deepest pardon for speaking so, I meant no disrespect. It's just, we don't say that name. Not here in the Vales, not in Boisford or any other kingdoms. Terribly sorry, I regret such rudeness from me hard, I do. Not at all, Colin said, giving their host a warm smile when he glanced nervously back. I apologize, I didn't mean to misstep. You do me quite a service with the warning, Marcel. I wouldn't want to offend the good people of this kingdom by mistake. Is it dangerous? Can dragons know when their names are spoken? Isaiah gave him a deeply amused look behind Marcel's back, her dark eyes glittering. Well, dunno about that, Lord, Marcel said with clear relief. Maybe so, maybe not. Who could say what the beast can do? It's more in a bit of superstition, I know it. May a body not be embarrassed to take such a fright at it. But that's life here in the Vales, Lord. Not a soul and single known loss at the dread's evil ends. That name is fear itself. And just like that, her amusement was gone. She turned to stare expressionlessly at the passing trees. Colin reached over to take her hand and she immediately clasped his fingers in return, running her thumb across them in a light caress, but did not look at him. Amazing how quickly a convivial mood could die. Fortunately it picked up as they progressed. Marcel seemed an irrepressible sort, not to mention an incorrigible gossip who was pleased to tell them every detail of life in his village and even more pleased to hear the news from south of the Vales. Colin's own news was somewhat out of date, as he'd spent the last year avoiding population centers as much as possible, but it was still apparently fresher than whatever had migrated into Boisford through the normal channels, or at least than whatever had made it this far into the countryside. The downside was that he was naturally quite curious about what a pair of foreign aristocrats, as he assumed them to be, were doing stranded in the woods, but Colin and Isaiah took it in turns to gently redirect the conversation whenever it came back around to them. Traffic picked up the farther they went, with more travelers passing them on the way out of the city ahead and others joining the highway in the same direction, approaching from the various paths and roads which turned onto it. Due to both the tree cover and the turns of the road itself, the view ahead was perpetually obscured. Their first sight of the city walls came when they rounded a bend and suddenly had to join a queue of carts and wagons lined up awaiting entry. Colin leaned over the side, watching a much steadier flow of individuals on foot moving ahead toward the gates between the stalled wagon lane and the outgoing traffic heading the other way. Might be faster afoot from here, Lord, Marcel said apologetically, tugging the brim of his hat again. Keepin' old Marcel company surely ain't worth delaying your business in town. I think we'll take your advice, Colin agreed, hopping over the side of the cart. He offered a hand to Isaiah, who again accepted his help to dismount with that pleased little smile of hers that he so enjoyed seeing. "Our thanks once more for the lift, Marcel. 'Twas the furthest thing from trouble, Lord. A bit o' company on the road is just the thing to make the journey less dull, aye." In truth, Colin felt he'd gained much more benefit than a reprieve for his feet, practice at listening to the local Fauvalan. Much better to get the hang of it on the road than once they were in the city, where he risked bungling an important conversation with a merchant or city guard, or worse. He dipped his fingers into his bag of holding, whose enchantments were as convenient as a Traximo's ever so helpful word network. That was why he'd chosen this one, that in its carrying capacity. It immediately placed the object he desired in his grasp, and in the next second Colin lightly tossed a silver coin to Marcel, who caught it by apparent reflex, fumbling slightly. "A small token of our appreciation, Marcel. You've been a splendid introduction to your country for two weary travelers." "Oh, now, Lord, I could never," the old man protested, holding the coin back out toward him. "Not for any amount, let alone so much. 'Twasn't single quotee the mayor's trouble, old Marcel's conscience couldn't leave two visitors afoot in the forest anymore, and it can rest well on undeserved gains." "I particularly appreciate the first familiarity with local customs you've granted me," Colin rejoined. "It's important to respect culture, don't you think? I'd hate to give offense out of ignorance." "Aye, but it's just that, Lord." Marcel insistently held out his gnarled old hand, the gleaming silver lying flat on his palm. "We Vale folk look after travelers on the road, those of us with a spark of decency in our souls. 'Tis no more or less than the shepherd asks." "We have a similar custom in the south." Smiling, Colin reached out to take the old man's hand in both of his own, and gently folded Marcel's fingers over the coin. "If I have the means to do a kindness for another, especially a kind soul who shows himself willing to help a traveler in turn, and I don't do so, I've as good as stolen from him. You wouldn't want to get me in trouble with the nine, would you? Or disrespect my culture, and me a guest in these lands?" "Oh. Well, that is." Grinning, Colin withdrew his hands and winked. "You've lost this one, my friend. But you were a worthy opponent." "Ha! Well, then, I must bear defeat with grace," Marcel finally agreed, grinning back. He held up the silver coin, wagging it reprovingly at Colin. "But we'll meet again, Lord, and I shall have anew me revenge. I'll see you accept my charity one day, see if I don't." "I'll look forward to the rematch." Smiling broadly, Isaroa stepped up to him and also reached out to clasp Marcel's hand, avoiding touching the coin. "For your kindness, good sir, may you be blessed by any and all powers which honor it. Compassionate souls are what make the world worth living in for us all." Colin felt the energy swell in her as she invoked some magic, but it faded before he could focus enough to analyze it. There was no visible effect, anyway, and in the next moment she simply stepped back to rejoin him. "Your courtesy is more precious than silver, laddie. You've made an old man's week. Shepherd watch over ye both, now." "Safe travels, friend," Colin agreed before finally turning to continue up the road, his wife strolling at his side, her hand once more entwined with his own. "You are good with people," she said softly, giving him a warm sidelong look through her lashes. "It is pleasing to see. I knew, of course, that you are a rather deft seducer, but it is surprising how often that does not translate to general social skills." "Yes, I've known a few very smart people with one-track minds that they kept firmly in their pants," he agreed. "I think it's the exception rather than the rule, though. It seems like most people who find their way to a lot of romantic successes started by working out how to handle people. Mostly because they like to." "Him." She gave him another little glance, still smiling, but this one was pensive. Colin quickly clamped down on himself before he blurted out anything else too telling. "Then again, I've known plenty of introverts who found their own. Good morrow, travelers." They came up short at being addressed. While chatting, they had followed the crowd all the way to the gates, and now one of the guards keeping watch had stepped forward, raising a hand. Most of them seemed to be inspecting the vehicles passing in and out, hence the delay. "Are you associated with the occupant of yonder cart, from which you disembarked?" The combination of more formal speech than Marcel's and a similar accent threw Colin off for a moment. Fortunately Isaroa stepped smoothly into the gap while he struggled to catch up. "The kind gentleman gave us a lift, as our own conveyance was lost in the journey. Truly, such compassion to foreign travelers is a credit to your realm." "Ah, I see." The guard nodded, but did not step back. "And should we expect to find anything untoward, when his cart is up for inspection?" "Untoward?" Colin repeated, frowning. He said it was potatoes. "I mean—" "Oh, you're concerned about contraband, of course. Well, it's not as if we inspected the sacks. That would be just my luck, though," he added with a sigh. "The one cart in which we hitch a ride turns out to be smuggling. I don't even know what's illegal here. Do you need us to step aside until it gets here?" "Sometimes, husband, you are too pure for this fallen world," Isaroa said fondly, reaching up to lightly touch his cheek. "Smugglers do not offer helpful rides to strangers on the road." "Yes, my love, now that you've said it out loud I can hear how obvious it is. Forgive me, our recent pattern of strange fortune has left me a bit paranoid." "It's quite all right, my lord and lady," the guard said, now smiling slightly. "No, I don't think we need delay you further. It's just my job to watch for these things, you understand." "Of course, no harm done at all," Colin reassured him. Finally, the man stepped back out of the way, nodding and gesturing them forward. "Apologies for the delay, travelers, merely due diligence. Please, proceed. Shepherd guide you." "Our thanks," Isaroa said, nodding politely as they proceeded past, and through the gate. She added in a much lower tone as soon as they were out of easy earshot, "Not bad, not bad." "My performance? Honestly, I don't think it was one of my best." "Not you, husband," she chuckled, squeezing his hand. "You reacted like an innocent man caught off guard. How very helpful that you didn't have to put up a front." "No, I meant the soldiers. It has been several years since I visited Boisvert, and the civil guard were of a lesser quality last time. These are firm but courteous, and not soliciting bribes. That diligence could do with some improvement, however. If he suspected us of wrongdoing he should have detained us until suspicion could be allayed. If he did not, he should not have interrupted us in the first place." Colin mused, peering around. They were strolling now up the broad central avenue into the city. In a way it was an urban counterpart to the highway outside, hard to see what lay ahead. The road curved away to the left not far ahead, though its width and gentle arcs seemed to pose no impediment to vehicle traffic. Also, the surrounding buildings were taller than he'd expected, especially right inside the walls. In Reykjavik and other imperial cities, there was a clear space inside the walls for strategic reasons. It was just as he'd seen from afar, too. Verdi architecture was complex and intricately detailed, with a great deal of ornamental ironwork in addition to the gargoyles and engravings which seemed to bedeck every building. Even their basic floor plans were overly complex, to judge by how many of the structures they passed had overhanging upper floors throwing shadows across the street. "This way," said Isaroa, tugging him gently down a side street. This one was somewhat smaller but still a major thoroughfare, in fact, a market district. Probably one of the most important ones, given its proximity to the gate. Colin dutifully followed her, taking in the sights and deducing what he could from them. He had known, of course, that this was no Reykjavik, but he was still taken aback by how homogeneous the crowd was, considering this was a national capital. Colin spotted a couple of elves browsing a nearby stall, and here and there over the crowd he could see the fuzzy upright ears of several types of therianthropes. It was overwhelmingly human, though, and not just human but predominantly the pale northerners who lived in this region. He and Isaroa drew curious glances, but no more than that, so apparently the people here weren't too shocked by foreigners. But that was it. There might be short folk in the crowd, though he couldn't see any from here. They were hard to spot in mixed groups for obvious reasons. Dwarves and halflings both liked underground settlements, so he could well imagine them settling into an area where the main danger came from the skies. He couldn't see a single greenskin or giantkin, however. "Ah, that will do nicely," his wife purred, pulling him over to a particular stand. "Let us not forget what brought us out in the first place. 2, please." "Coming right up," proclaimed the stocky entrepreneur behind the counter, accepting the pennies she handed over and dunking a pair of the skewers he was grilling in the tub next to the fire before handing them over. "And a bit of extra sauce for the loveliest young couple I've seen today. Truly, I can't judge which of you is the luckier." "Oh, it's definitely me," Colin assured him, accepting one of the skewers, as did Isaiah. "I'd love to stand here and explain why, but that'd keep us all afternoon, and you've got a business to run." "Well, I never argue with a customer. But from what I'm hearing, the lady's not doing too badly herself." The fellow winked and Isaiah smirked back, already pulling Colin gently out of the way for the next customer. The smell of it abruptly reminded him that he'd had nothing but coarse travel rations to eat in days. Only concern for the well-being of the most expensive garments he'd ever owned restrained him from unseemly haste as he lifted the skewer to his mouth and bit in. For a second, he actually had to pause, heedless of his wife and the surrounding crowd. He didn't quite succeed in suppressing a soft noise deep in his throat as flavors burst across his tongue. The meat was a bit gamey, but for someone who'd been subsisting on jerky and flatbread it was as good as tenderloin. Vegetables crunched with it in counterpoint, the savory fat mingling with the sweet and spicy sauce. It was simple street food, cheap and unremarkable. It was amazing. He was 3 bites in and nearly done with his skewer before he noticed Isaiah gazing up at him, and belatedly realized what a spectacle he was making. Sorry." She smiled, bright and warm, and reached up to again touch his face. "You are beautiful in unguarded moments of pleasure. Not that I haven't observed it already, but it remains a joy to see." For once, Colin found himself without a smooth reply on the tip of his tongue. It hit him unexpectedly, but even with forewarning he wasn't sure what he should actually say to that. The feeling it caused in his chest was distracting. And, yep, his mouth was open. Cheeks hot. What a disappointing display. Thank you." Her smile widened, and it was all he could do not to outright wince. "What's this? Finally I catch you without a ready witticism?" Your pardon, my lady wife, for disappointing you. I've never been told something like that before. It's a little unfair to just spring it on a fellow." The mirth faded from her expression. The dark shapes of her disguised eyes shifted subtly as she examined his face in detail. "You have had other partners, surely. I have been in your arms enough to know it was not I who taught you how." "Well, sure," he deflected. "There is of course no pursuit in which I would presume to think myself your equal, but I haven't just tumbled off the potato cart, except in the most prosaically literal sense. There, see?" Colin added a winsome, slightly mischievous little smile of his own, reaching out to brush her soft cheek with the back of his fingers. The ones without grease on them, of course. There it is, back already. He was accustomed to her delightedly playing along, but this time, her expression stayed sober. She studied him in pensive silence for a second longer before replying, her tone soft. "You have been mishandled by past loves, I see. This I find unsatisfactory." Taking his hand again with her free one, she gently pulled him back into motion, sliding through the urban crowd which was ignoring them as urban crowds mostly did. "I shall have to make it my business to fill your memories with more happiness, husband. It is the very least you deserve." And just like that, he found himself once again without a ready response. So, since it seemed all he could do, he simply followed her deeper into the city. Chapter 21. Just beyond the market area was a semicircular plaza kept clear of stalls, though it was lined by storefronts. Streets branched off it in 3 directions, and its purpose was made obvious by the presence of vehicles, many waiting patiently for use. Several wagons were being unloaded or loaded by porters carrying goods into the market, but most seemed to be small, row-offless carriages. Horse-drawn carts, actually more like chariots, being on 2 wheels, with an elevated seat in the front for the driver and a single horse to pull. For some reason they were all black, which Colin assumed must be a cultural thing as there didn't seem any practical reason for it. In terms of practicality, he was mostly taken aback by the startling inefficiency of this. In Revkabot the same role was filled by rickshaws, pulled by their owners, in person. What about Boisvord made horses the preferred option? Rickshaw operators had much less overhead to worry about, and also their business model didn't add unnecessary livestock to traffic, nor dung to the street. Colin could already see, and smell, that the streets of Boisvord were not swept as often as those of Revkabot, despite clearly needing it more. Isaroa led him without hesitation to a carriage which she seemed to have selected on the basis that it looked nicer than most of the others, with a burgundy canvas awning over its passenger seats and gold embellishments on its side panels. Slightly flaking gold-colored paint, but that was more than most of them had. "And a fine afternoon to you, my lady, my lord," the bearded coachman called as Isaroa stepped right into his vehicle without pausing. "Where'll it be?" "Do you know the Renaissance, sir?" she asked, extending a hand to help Colin up after her. He of course hardly needed it, but sauce for the goose was sauce for the gander. The unfamiliarity of the gesture actually made him hesitate slightly before he accepted it. The idea of Hactria doing such a thing was painfully laughable. "But of course, their driver replied cheerfully, flicking the reins. His horse obediently plodded out into the road. "A fine choice, and it's not your first visit to our fair city, I gather." "I have found occasion to pass through from time to time," she said, wearing a relaxed, cat-like smile which only Colin could see, since the driver was facing forward. "Splendid. Then welcome back. Boisvord is surely a bit lovelier for hosting such a pair of pretty faces. I'll tell you, though, if you're interested in stretching your wings a bit, I know an even more charming establishment which would be delighted to host you." "Thank you, but I always stay at the Renaissance." "Lady's choice, of course. I'll take you wherever you care to go, my noble friends, no fear of that. But should you take a notion to stay a night at the Red Lily, just the mention that Forchero recommended you will guarantee treatment befitting royalty. Why, after just a night of the regal treatment, I wager you'd find yourself with a new favorite. The Renaissance, if you please." It was amazing. She did not raise her voice nor even alter her tone in a way Colin could have described, but suddenly there was steel under the velvet. "And so it shall be, my lady," Forchero said smoothly. "I'll have you there in not half a jiffy." Isaroa seemingly did not consider that worthy of a response, simply shifting on the seat to cuddle up against Colin, resting her head on his shoulder. It was incredible how warm and comforting he found the gesture, chaste as it was. He leaned his own head against hers, murmuring, "That was odd. I've never heard of a taximan arguing with his patrons about where they wanted to go." "Industries at home are more closely regulated than here, husband," she answered, not troubling to lower her voice. It was debatable how audible she was to the coachman over the surrounding traffic, but this was certainly not discreet. You can expect to encounter all manner of little kickback schemes that would be discouraged in Revkabot. Doubtless he gets a finder's fee from the Red Lily for bringing them customers, and just as doubtless, it is an inferior establishment. Lodgings up to my standards are more exclusive about their clientele. Do keep a wary eye out, my love. Some drivers and the like will attempt to rob or abduct passengers who seem not otherwise profitable. Fortunately, the local constabulary are usually aware who engages in such trade, and thus there is often little fuss raised when they are found disemboweled in an alley. Colin glanced at Forchero's back, which revealed nothing, then back down at Isaroa. Her lips had curled up in a mischievous expression he could not help finding infectious. "Now, my darling, you know I would do anything for you, but I must insist we abstain from any disavowalment on this trip. These are my nice clothes. I know beheading is faster, beloved, but you know how major arteries tend to spray. It gets positively everywhere." "Nonsense, you just have to be careful to aim the blackguard away from your vestments before popping the cork. Doubtless some oaf will try to rob us at some point. I'll show you how it's done. I do so enjoy watching you work." As macabre joking went, this honestly wasn't even as dark as some of what he and his fellow scribes had gotten up to at the tavern after a particularly long day's work. It added a slight damper to his mood that in Isaiah's case, this knowledge was probably not theoretical. Not just him, either, to judge by the way the driver was now hunching in his seat. It was a pretty quiet ride from there. At least Forchiro was professional enough to bid farewell with his previous good cheer upon dropping them off and getting paid. They disembarked from the coach in front of a structure which, at least externally, didn't seem to stand out from its surroundings aside from its size. Like most Verdi buildings, its second floor overhung enough to leave part of the street in shadow. On the ground floor the stonework was ornately carved, with its windows secured behind iron bars which themselves had been cast in fancifully decorative shapes. A guard stood outside the door, which didn't even have a sign or anything else to indicate the purpose of what lay within. Apparently Isaiah had not been kidding about the exclusivity of this place. The woman standing by the door had a rapier and dagger belted at her waist and carried a spear, which seemed excessive to Colin, and wore embossed leather armor over some sort of servant's livery. She did not salute, bow, or otherwise acknowledge them, standing at attention and staring ahead with discipline that seemed superior to what the actual city guards had shown, but upon their approach thumped the butt of her spear sharply against the stone step. Immediately the door opened, revealing a servant who pulled it wide for them and stepped aside, holding the door and bowing deeply. His outfit seemed strange to Colin, being mostly black with a snug coat that had long tails in the back and a knotted ornament around his neck, but obviously it was cultural. Naturally the Verdi would have different customs. There was very little contact between them and Rivak. He watched Isaiah sidelong, taking his cues from her, which in this case consisted of gliding past the guard and servant without acknowledging them. Colin played along, suppressing his unease. By the standards of behavior which she herself had instituted in Rivak, such rudeness to underlings was a major social faux pas, not to mention somewhat offensive to Riva moral sensibilities. Then again, all the Empire's high-minded rhetoric about justice and compassion and equality hadn't stopped his own superiors and intimates from shoving him in the cell for the crime of being politically inconvenient. They strolled through the entry foyer into an atrium which featured a desk against the wall opposite the entrance and a wide-arched door was leading in both other directions. The place's decor made it seem dim despite the abundant lamps. There were no exterior windows, and the overall coloring was dark. Stone walls were covered except for their support pillars in polished walnut paneling, and the carpet was a deep wine red. The doors were decorated with inset panels of stained glass which so closely reminded Colin of the Tameglass back at the lair that he suspected the design had been inspired directly by a similar timekeeper ruin. Lady Roa, the elderly but clearly spry man standing behind the counter, smiled and greeted her with a kind of understated effusiveness unlike anything Colin had ever seen, somehow encapsulating the excitement of a friendly puppy and the diffident poise of a servant. What an unexpected delight. It has been far too long since you graced our establishment. I agree, she replied, smiling warmly as the two of them stepped up to the desk. May I introduce my husband, Arkansas Colin? It is my intention to spoil him incorrigibly during our visit to Boisvert, a plan which perforce includes staying at the Renaissance. It is an honor and a pleasure, Lord Arkansas Colin, the concierge replied, bowing graciously to him. And both are mine, Colin said gallantly. This fellow spoke highly formal Philvalin, more reminiscent of the books from which he'd learned. It was easier for him to follow than the speech of farmers, coachmen, and city guards. My lady wife's endorsement is as good as a command, so far as I am concerned. Her taste in all things is more than impeccable. So I have observed. That you should return to our hospitality is the highest praise we could receive, Lady Roa. She smiled, and while it was clearly a social expression, Colin thought he discerned real amusement. Nothing but the finest for my love. Dare I hope that my usual suite is available? The concierge's answering expression was at once poised and tragic. Really, he could have made a living on the stage. Alas, it grieves me to inform you that the Saffron suite is presently occupied, and also committed immediately following the present guest's departure. To have disappointed you brings shame upon our house, my lady. Not in the least. She who blows in like the autumn leaves has no call to complain that those with the courtesy to make reservations receive the first pick of lodgings. It is I who must ask your pardon. Unplanned circumstance brings us to Boisford, else I would have assuredly made proper arrangements in advance. Worry not, husband, I assure you there are no less than excellent accommodations at the Renaissance. The concern never crossed my mind, he replied, struggling to keep his voice smooth and expression pleasant as she set down gold coins on the counter. The number and size of them. His salary at the Royal Archives would take more than a year to add up to that. I cannot imagine being disappointed by any establishment you so readily endorse. And the Renaissance shall take both pleasure and pride in meeting and surpassing your expectations, my lady, my lord. The concierge had already made the coins vanish so adroitly it verged on legerdemain. How long shall we have the honor of your company on this occasion? Isaiah glanced at Colin as if for confirmation before answering. Playing along, he nodded back at her, though he realistically had nothing to contribute here. Will it be a problem if the duration is somewhat vague? We shall be at least one night, likely two. Depending on how our business proceeds, there is a chance we might need to extend our stay beyond that, but I consider it a small one. The concierge had already opened a book and begun leafing through it. He now nodded and picked up a pen. It is no difficulty in the least, my lady. Under the circumstances. In the event that you decide to stay with us longer than a week, I fear it may become necessary to change your rooms after that point. I apologize most profusely for any inconvenience. Oh, I shouldn't think it would take us that long. And if it does, we can bear such a trifling upset with ease. Splendid. We do in fact have an available suite which I dare to presume will satisfy even your lofty standards. The Renaissance is honored to welcome you again. Having finished jotting down something in his ledger, he closed and set it aside, then picked up a small hand bell and gave it a single ring, producing a surprisingly pleasing, clear tone. Instantly, from a curtained doorway behind him emerged another person in what Colin presumed to be servant's livery, though the uniform did not match that of the man answering the front door. Show Lady Roa and Lord Arkansas Colin to the Garnet suite and ensure they are comfortable. The man bowed to them. At once. My lady, my lord, if you would follow me? Hand in hand, they followed him out one of the side doors to the reception area, then up 2 flights of stairs and down a hallway. Isaiah simply glided along in perfect serenity as if fully in her element, but Colin studied their surroundings as they passed. There was more of that glowingly polished wood paneling, stained glass, and rich carpet. The place all but radiated wealth, and also restrained taste. The aesthetic was very different from what the wealthy and powerful of Rev Cabot favored, of course, but some things were universal. Expensive was expensive. And as it turned out, he hadn't seen anything yet. The servant made himself an almost invisibly discreet presence even as he brought them to a door, handed Isaiah a key, showed them where the bell was that would summon service, and departed as ephemerally as a ghost, leaving them standing in an entry foyer which to Colin's eyes looked like it belonged at the front of a palace. The floor was polished white marble, the domed ceiling stained glass illuminated from behind by some artifice which made it resemble to glass, and the fluted marble columns were inset with some kind of deep, red lacquer carved into faceted shapes which clearly gave the suite its name. It couldn't possibly be actual garnet, just from the quantity of it, but the resemblance was convincing. And this was just the entry. "So," he said to cover his gawking, "you're not supposed to acknowledge servants in this culture?" "It depends upon the servant," Isaiah replied, giving him a smile and pulling him by the hand through the arched doorway into their suite proper. Private guards and domestic servants have a kind of ethic of invisibility, a standard that if their tasks are performed well, their existence will not even be noticed by those they serve. To acknowledge them is to rebuke their performance, and if they have not actually erred, they will take offense. By contrast, cooks, waiters, and bartenders will be extremely sociable with their customers. Or rather, they are expected to, and their conviviality is deemed as central a feature of their jobs as the quality of the food. You saw how assertive and entrepreneurial drivers can be. For shopkeepers, it depends entirely on the category of shop. Merchants and moneylenders will also be talkative, but restrained and discreet. The different standards for different kinds of entertainers are truly Byzantine. That sounds complicated and rather arbitrary. The foyer opened into a parlor of some kind. Their in-room had a parlor, and somehow, door was opening in two directions. One of those led to a small private dining room, the other presumably to the bedchamber. It was partially obscured on the other side by a decorative folding screen. This room had plush seating, velvet wall drapes, two of the largest landscape paintings Colin had ever seen hung upon the patterned wallpaper. There were also a large freestanding harp and a keyboard instrument of some kind he didn't recognize. "I have found the Verdi to be like every other culture, reasonable." She gave him a warm smile, sauntering toward the bedroom with him trailing along behind. That is, lenient toward obvious foreigners who flub the more arcane details of their etiquette. Most people in most places will recognize and appreciate a good-faith attempt at respect. It was more of the same in the next room, opulent to an extent that seemed borderline absurd to Colin's perspective. The bed alone. Well, he could tell it was a product of the same culture as the one he was using back in the lair, albeit piled with neatly folded silk brocade rather than furs. Everything else was along the same lines, and he ignored it to focus on Isaiah, whom he found more interesting anyway. "And? Lady Roa?" At that, she turned, meeting his amused smirk with a wry little grimace of acknowledgement. "Not one of my more sophisticated deceptions, I'll admit. It is not without reason, though. The Verdi. Well, these northern cultures in general are steeped in secrecy and subterfuge. They consistently value perseverance, privacy, and discretion. The values of cultures shaped by the constant threat of death from above," Colin did not say, simply listening to her explanation. "I have found it best not to attempt to cross wits with them on their own ground. Not that I couldn't, did I deem it worth the effort. The courts of Rivkabat are as prone to intrigue as those of any nation. What is interesting about the North is how skullduggery that elsewhere would characterize the halls of power permeates society at every level. To meet them on their own terms would require a thorough grounding in the nuances of their culture which I have never troubled to acquire. Instead, I found that they will recognize and respect simple discretion. So long as I gently discourage inquiries into my personal business and make myself a source of profit and no trouble, those with whom I must deal here consistently take it upon themselves to protect my privacy." "I suppose," he agreed, "it's a harmless enough little concession. After all, it's a couple of syllables that could pop up in all kinds of names. And if they happen to coincide with a similar name, of a certain august personage from another nearby nation," she continued, grinning mischievously, "well, what under the first and last heavens would she be doing here? Sometimes, husband, refuge and audacity is as impermeable as the strictest secrecy." She continued her exploration, opening one door to find a walk-in closet, then another, which opened onto a lavishly appointed bathing chamber. Colin followed her more slowly now, allowing the distance to stretch out between them. He found himself studying her anew, barely noticing the ornate marble bathroom. "Ah, good, this matches the quality of the one in my usual suite. I fear the amenities back home have quite spoiled me. Truly, There is no sweeter decadence than a hot bath. Actually, this one makes bubbles, an experience which must be felt to be appreciated. I look forward to showing you many such things, husband. Isaroa. She went still, then straightened. Currently her back was to him, but he could see that she knew what he was about to say. It was strange, this certainty. He wasn't invoking his powers to glimpse her mind, not that they even worked that way in the first place. Really, they hadn't known one another long enough to have developed such a true intimacy. And yet, looking at her, he was certain. She knew. It's everywhere. In countless little details. It permeates this whole culture. I can see it everywhere despite barely having gotten my first glimpses of it. They are entirely shaped by fear and danger. By living under the threat of dragon attack. Isaroa just stood there, her back to him, silent. Waiting for him to come to the point. I don't really expect any different from the others, honestly. Imaralafine and Tiavathyris, well. They don't seem very interested in people. In mortals, that is. And the kids have grown up where they have, they can't really be blamed for it. I get the impression they haven't had the opportunity to actually know many mortals, if any. But you're different. You understand people. You care about people, I know you do. Her head shifted minutely. The volume of her curly hair made the motion somewhat inscrutable from the back. He thought it might have been a nod. I know how this sounds, but I'm genuinely not making any accusations. I am very much aware of the absurdity of someone with my limited perspective critiquing the actions of a being such as yourself. I just would like to understand, please, the damage you've caused this civilization, this entire group of civilizations. It's not only catastrophic in intensity, but on an unimaginable scale. How does someone with your perspective live with this? Finally, she half turned, bringing her face into profile so she could look at him sidelong. Her expression was resigned, and yet oddly serene. Stoic. Very well. I suppose I owe you that, at least. Tope continued,